The highway into Dustfield, Montana did not welcome visitors. It simply allowed them the way a river allows a stone dropped into it briefly without ceremony, closing over whatever disturbed it almost before the disturbance registered. The road ran flat and gray beneath a sky the color of old pewter, and the land on either side stretched in every direction without apology, vast and wind-scoured and indifferent to the season. October had arrived early this year. The grasslands had already surrendered their color, fading from gold to dull brown to something closer to ash, and the pines along the ridgeline had turned dark and skeletal against the failing afternoon light. Cole Raines drove into all of it without slowing down. He was 36 years old, though the lines around his eyes suggested a man who had spent those years doing something harder than most. His hair was cut short the way it had been for 13 years without variation, dark and precise above a face that was angular and weathered and difficult to read. A scar ran from the corner of his jaw up toward his left ear, faint beneath a short growth of beard he had stopped managing somewhere around the first week after discharge. His eyes were gray-blue and steady, the kind that registered the position of every window and door in an unfamiliar room without appearing to look. He sat straight behind the wheel, not rigid, just grounded the way a man sits when stillness is something he has had to learn, rather than something that came naturally. In the passenger seat, Duke watched the road. Duke was a 5-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat and a black saddle pattern that ran thick across his back and shoulders. His ears stood tall and precise, except for the left one, which had a small notch near the tip from a training incident 2 years earlier. His amber eyes were serious and intelligent, and he sat with the same quality of alertness that Cole carried, calm on the surface, processing everything underneath. He had been trained for military work detection and tactical support, and when Cole left the service, Duke left with him. The bond between them had been formed under conditions that civilian language did not have adequate words for. It was not loyalty in the ordinary sense. It was something older and more reliable than that. They had been driving for 3 days. Cole had not planned the destination carefully. He had planned only the leaving. 18 months after his final deployment, 18 months of rented rooms and irregular sleep, and the particular exhaustion that comes not from doing too much, but from no longer knowing what to do, he had found the listing for the Harlow Ranch property in a county auction notice he had no particular reason to be reading. 100 acres in Gallatin County, Montana. Legal status disputed. Reason death of co-owner. Listed price $10. He had looked at that number for a long time. Then he had made a phone call. Then he had packed what fit in the truck. Then he had driven. The county property office in Duskfield was a single-story building with faded lettering above the door and a heating system that worked better in theory than in practice. The clerk behind the counter was a thin man in his 50s with reading glasses perched low on his nose and the neutrality of someone who had processed too many documents to find any of them interesting. He reviewed Cole's identification without comment. He produced the transfer paperwork with the bored ease of a man performing a routine transaction on a routine afternoon. Cole signed where indicated. The land had been locked in legal suspension since the death of Frank Harlow, one of 2 co-owners of the property. Taxes unpaid, operations halted. The surviving partner had consolidated assets and stepped away from active management. No one in the county wanted to touch the acreage given the unresolved questions around the estate. The $10 price was not generosity. It was the cost of a problem no one else wanted to inherit. Cole did not ask many questions. He was not there for a bargain. He was there for the distance, the quiet, the particular kind of silence that Montana offered, which was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something larger than noise, something that might, if he gave it enough time, fill in some of the space that 13 years of other people's emergencies had hollowed out of him. The clerk stamped the final document and slid it across the counter without ceremony. "You're the owner," he said. Cole picked up the paper. "Yes," he said. Duke was waiting in the truck when he came back out. The dog watched him approach through the passenger window. with the calm attention of someone who had already assessed the surroundings and found nothing requiring immediate action. Cole got in. He sat for a moment with the paperwork on the seat beside him. Then he started the engine. By the time they turned off the main road onto the gravel track that led to Harlow Ranch, the sun had dropped behind the mountain ridge, and the sky was moving through purple into dark. The temperature had fallen sharply. Cole's breath came in faint clouds inside the cab. Ahead, the ranch emerged from the dusk in pieces, a rusted iron gate standing open, a long gravel drive flanked by fence posts, trailing broken wire, the main house at the end of it all, white paint peeling at every edge, the porch boards gone gray with years of exposure. Cole let the truck roll to a stop in front of the house and cut the engine. Duke did not move immediately. His head lifted. His ears shifted forward with the precision that Cole recognized and had learned not to dismiss. In years of working together in conditions where mistakes had permanent consequences, Duke had never flagged something that wasn't there. He had also never missed something that was. Cole said nothing. He waited. Duke's posture changed, not aggressive, not alarmed. Something more careful than either of those things. He was reading the air, reading the ground, reading information that Cole's senses were not equipped to gather at this distance, in this darkness. His muscles were engaged beneath his coat, but his body was still. His eyes were fixed on the front of the house. Cole got out of the truck quietly. He stood on the gravel and let his own senses calibrate. Cold air, dry wood and old hay. A silence that had settled deeply into the property over weeks or months of abandonment. No smoke from the chimney, no light in the windows, no vehicles other than his own. Duke stepped down from the truck and moved ahead nose low, working the ground toward the porch with deliberate concentration. Cole followed a half step behind. His right hand was relaxed but available. He was not afraid. He had been in situations that warranted fear often enough to understand the difference between a situation that called for alarm and one that called for attention. This one called for attention. He found the key the county clerk had provided and worked the front door lock. The hinges complained with the resigned creak of hardware that had not moved in some time. The interior smelled of dust and closed air and the faint ghost of wood smoke from a fire that had not burned in weeks. Furniture remained in place, a couch, a wooden table, a bookshelf with gaps where volumes had been removed and not replaced. Faint gray light filtered through curtains that had not been opened in longer than Cole had owned the property. Duke moved inside first. He took 3 steps and stopped. The growl was low and even and carried no aggression. It was a signal, not a threat. It was Duke telling Cole that something was here, something alive, something that had not announced itself. Cole's weight shifted, not back, not forward, simply balanced. He let his eyes move through the shadows without rushing them. The room was long and low-ceiling. The fireplace sat at the far end, stone and dark iron, and beside it, pressed into the angle where the wall met the floor, a figure was crouched. A young woman, arms wrapped around her knees, face turned toward them, with eyes that were wan and watchful, but not without calculation. She had been there long enough that she had chosen her position, deliberately the corner at her back fireplace to her left, a clear line of sight to both the front door and the hallway leading deeper into the house. She was not simply hiding. She had set up a defensive position. Cole studied her for a moment without speaking. Then he reached to the side wall, found the light switch, and turned on the single overhead bulb that still worked. The light was pale and unsteady, but it was better than the dark. He pulled a wooden chair from the table, turned it away from her, and sat down. He laced his fingers together loosely and let his hands rest on his knees. Duke understood. The dog walked to Cole's left side and lay down on the floor, shin on his paws, eyes still on the woman, but his posture entirely relaxed. The shift was visible. Duke moved from guard mode to something softer and more deliberate, a presentation of calm rather than threat. The woman's breathing was fast and shallow. She looked at the tone. Something in the rigid set of her shoulders changed. "My name is Cole Rains," he said. His voice was low and level. "That's Duke. He won't move unless I tell him to." She did not respond immediately. She was in her mid-20s with chestnut hair loose around her shoulders, strands sticking to her face. Her skin was pale from time without sunlight. She was wearing a faded canvas jacket over a dark sweater, jeans dusty at the knees. No shoes. There was a partially healed scrape along her left ankle. She looked like someone who had been living carefully and quietly for longer than was comfortable, managing fear the way people manage pain when they expect it to last. Her eyes were green and sharp, and despite the exhaustion in every line of her face, they were alert. "You're not with him," she said. It was not quite a question. "I bought this property today," Cole said. "From the county, $10. Silence settled between them. Duke shifted slightly, rolling to one side and exposing his belly, the body language of a dog communicating that he posed no threat. It was a move that required no training to understand. The woman looked at the dog for a long moment. Then she straightened slowly. She stood keeping her back near the wall, and Cole saw that she was holding something against her side with her right arm. A notebook, small and worn, its cover bent and water-stained at one corner. "Meg Harlow," she said, "this ranch belonged to my father." Cole nodded once. He did not ask her to keep talking. He did not fill the silence with reassurance or questions. He had spent 13 years in environments where the discipline of waiting was more valuable than the urgency of knowing, and he had brought that discipline home with him, even when he had not managed to bring much else. She set the notebook on the table between them. She opened it. 3 weeks of handwritten entries filled the pages. Dates, times, license plate numbers, names, notes on duration of visits, arrival and departure times, the specific patterns of movement around a property across town, a house she had been observing from a distance. The entries were detailed and systematic, written in the small, controlled handwriting of someone who had trained herself to document carefully. Some entries had double underlines beneath them. Some had question marks. Some had nothing but a date and a time and a number. Cole looked at the notebook without touching it. "How long have you been in this house?" he said. 11 days, she said. "I got in before the locks were changed. I knew the back window. My father never fixed the frame." She sat down on the edge of the couch. Duke rose and walked toward her unhurriedly, stopping 2 feet away and sitting. She looked at him. After a moment, she extended one hand palm down and let him sniff. He nudged gently against her fingers. She exhaled. "My father's name was Frank Harlow," she said. "He owned this ranch for 22 years. He built everything on it, from a working farm into a real operation. Cattle, hay, grazing contracts. He knew every fence post and every gate on 100 acres. He knew the soil and the weather and the equipment the way a man knows his own hands." She paused. His partner was a man named Wade Colton. They had run the business side of the ranch together for 8 years. Wade handled contracts, financial reporting, buyer relationships. Frank handled operations. It worked because Frank trusted him. She said the word trusted the way someone says a word they have been reconsidering for weeks. 6 weeks before my father died, he started noticing things. Revenue from cattle shipments that didn't match what the buyers were paying, feed invoices for deliveries that hadn't come in at the quantities billed. Small numbers at first, the kind of thing you could explain as clerical error if you didn't look too closely. My father looked closely. He always looked closely. She turned a page in the notebook. He started keeping his own records, handwritten, comparing them to Wade's digital reports line by line. They didn't match, not by accident. The discrepancies were systematic and consistent. Money was being moved somewhere. Not all of it. Not obviously. Just enough in enough different places that if you weren't paying attention, you would never see it. My father estimated at least 8 months of systematic diversion before he caught it. Tens of thousands of dollars. Her jaw tightened. He went to a man named Harlan Fitch. Harlan runs a small electronics shop on the east side of town. He's in his 60s, retired Air Force communications technician. Quiet man, patient, the kind who listens more than he talks. My father asked him for something small, discreet, something that could record without being noticed. Harlan helped him select a unit no larger than a matchbox and showed him how to mount it inside a standard smoke detector casing, aimed at his desk in the sitting area where meetings were held. Recorded to a micro SD card inside the unit, she looked up from the notebook. My father was not a technical person. He asked Harlan to keep the whole thing between them. Harlan agreed. He said he had done similar work a long time ago in places where trust had to be earned before it could be extended. Harlan also told my father to keep a paper copy of everything he'd found in the accounts, separate from the ranch office, somewhere Wade would never look. Cole was listening with the quality of stillness that had made him effective in rooms where listening was the most dangerous thing a man could do, complete and unremarkable, giving nothing away about what he was taking in. He confronted Wade once, Meg said, casually, over coffee in the ranch office, mentioned the discrepancies and suggested they might be clerical error just to see how Wade responded. Wade blamed the accounting firm, called it a systems issue, smiled while he said it. My father said it was the smile that told him everything he needed to know. She set the notebook flat on the table. A month ago, the generator shed behind the barn exploded. The official investigation took 4 days. Their conclusion was mechanical failure, a fuel line rupture, accidental ignition. My father had reportedly been performing a routine evening inspection when it happened. She stopped. She pressed her lips together and looked at the floor. My father maintained that generator every week without fail for 14 years. He knew every component and every sound it made and every pressure reading it was supposed to show. He would not have missed a fuel line leak. He would not have been in that shed at 9:40 at night for a routine inspection. That was not how he did things. That was not who he was. She looked up. I told Wade I didn't believe it was an accident. I told him the day after the funeral when he came to the house to discuss asset transfer. He looked at me with the most careful expression I have ever seen on a person's face, and he said that grief makes people imagine things they need to make sense of. She said it flatly, verbatim, without inflection. 2 nights later, someone followed me home from the grocery store. Headlights that turned when I turned and stopped when I stopped and disappeared when I pulled into my neighbor's driveway instead of my own. I sat in my neighbor's car for 45 minutes before I moved. She looked at Cole directly. I came here because I needed somewhere to be that Wade didn't control. I came here because my father had said once, not long before he died, that if anything ever went sideways, the office would know. I didn't understand what he meant until after the investigation closed. Cole said nothing. He was building a picture, assembling it from details rather than from narration, the way he had learned to assemble intelligence in environments where the wrong assumption had permanent consequences. The camera, he said, still in the smoke detector casing on the ceiling. Wade changed the exterior locks, but he never went through the interior carefully. He didn't know it was there. You went back to check. I went back one night before he changed the locks completely. I saw it was still mounted. I couldn't get the card out alone. I didn't have time and I didn't have what I needed. Cole let a silence develop. Outside, the wind had picked up, pressing against the porch eaves with a sound like breathing. Duke had settled fully beside Meg, his weight resting gently against her leg, and she had stopped noticing that she was resting her hand on his back. There is something else, she said. Cole waited. Wade Colton is my godfather. She said it without any particular emphasis, which made it more difficult to receive than if she had said it with grief or anger. He stood beside my father at my parents' wedding. He was there the night I was born. He spent Christmas at this table for 15 years. My father trusted him the way you trust someone who has already cost you something and come back anyway. Cole looked at her steadily. 15 years ago, Wade had a ranch of his own north of Billings. He ran it into debt. Equipment costs, a drought year, a bad contract with a buyer who defaulted. He lost everything. My father found out through a mutual contact, drove up there, and spent 3 days helping Wade settle what he could before the bank took the rest. Then he brought him down here and gave him a role in this operation. He did not ask to be repaid. He did not hold it over Wade's head. He just said, "That's what friends are for." She looked at the fire unlit. Wade has been taking money from this ranch for at least 8 months. Not because he needed it the way he needed it 15 years ago. He was doing it because he could. And when my father found out and told him he was going to the bank in the morning, Wade couldn't stand it. He couldn't stand being seen clearly by the man who had seen him at his worst and helped him anyway. The room was cold and the overhead light was pale and the wind outside was steady and the night beyond the windows was complete. Cole sat with what she had told him and let it settle into the shape it wanted to take. He had known men like Wade Colton, not exactly like him, but men who operated comfortably behind a surface that other people found reassuring. Men who understood that trust, once established, becomes a form of cover. He had worked alongside such men, and he had worked against such men, and he understood the particular kind of damage they caused, which was not just the damage of the immediate act, but the damage they did to the judgment of anyone who had believed in them. He also knew what it meant that Meg had come here. She had not come here to hide. She had come here because this was the one location connected to the evidence she needed, the last place where her father's careful work might still be intact, and she had come here alone and without sufficient resources and had been waiting for 11 days for something to change. She was not asking to be rescued. She was asking for capability she didn't have. Cole looked at the notebook on the table between them. 3 weeks of observation documented with the patience and precision of someone who had decided that if the official process was not going to pursue this, she was going to build a case herself. He looked at Duke, who was settled beside Meg with the quality of presence Cole had learned to read as a kind of assessment. Duke was calm because he had decided the situation warranted calm. The dog was rarely wrong about this. "Tell me about the camera," Cole said. "Where exactly in the room?" She told him. She described the office layout from memory, the desk position, the filing cabinet along the south wall, the ranch maps pinned to the corkboard above the side table, the location of the smoke detector casing on the ceiling mounted 8 feet up and angled toward the meeting area. She described the window on the east side, the one with the warped wooden frame that had never latched properly since the summer 2 years ago, when the frame swelled in the heat. She described the gravel drive in the equipment shed and the distance from the tree line to the west side of the building. She had already mapped it. She had already thought through how it might be accessed. "The man he has watching the property," Cole said. "Tell me what you know about him." Meg turned a page in the notebook. "His name is Gus Tanner. I found it in old employment papers my father kept. Wade hired him about 3 months ago. Heavy build. He drives a dark green pickup and parks it near the equipment shed. He runs a loop around the property maybe every 40 minutes or so, always the same circuit." She paused. "There's a younger one too. I've seen him twice, maybe 3 times, but not regularly. He comes and goes, then moves faster than Gus." Cole filed that. 2 men on the property, Gus Tanner on a regular rotation. The second one irregular, unpredictable. "Is Wade using the office building?" "No, he shut down operations after the legal freeze. Said it was too complicated to continue. The building is locked." Cole nodded slowly. He looked at the table, at the notebook, at the rough map of the office building's interior that Meg had sketched on the last page. He looked at Duke. Duke looked back at him with amber eyes that had done this before and were prepared to do it again. "Get some sleep," Cole said. He stood from the chair. "I'm going to need the daylight tomorrow." Meg looked at him. "What are you going to do?" He was already moving toward the hallway to check the rest of the house. He spoke without turning back. "Confirm the camera is still there, and count how many men we're actually dealing with." She was quiet for a moment. Then that property belongs to Wade now, legally. If you go in there, I've done worse things, Cole said, for worse reasons. It was not bravado. His voice carried it the way a man carries a fact he has examined thoroughly and accepted without drama. He said it like a statement of operational history, which was exactly what it was. He found blankets in the back bedroom closet and brought them out without comment. He set them on the couch. He checked the back door lock and the window latches in the kitchen. He banked some wood in the fireplace from the stack near the hearth and got a small fire going, more for light than warmth, though the warmth was not unwelcome. Duke followed him through each room and then settled near the front door in the position he always chose when his primary job was watching, where he could see both the entrance and the hallway junction. Meg sat on the couch wrapped in the blankets and watched the fire. She did not look like someone who had been relieved of a burden. She looked like someone who had, for the first time in 11 days, stopped being entirely alone with it. Outside, the Montana night had settled in completely. The wind moved across the grasslands in long, rolling gusts that bent the fence posts and scattered grit along the gravel drive. The mountains were invisible in the dark present, only as an absence of stars at the horizon. Cold pressed against every window and found the gaps in every frame. Inside the ranch house, the fire held. Cole sat in the chair near the door with his arms resting on his knees and his eyes on the middle distance, running the terrain through his mind. Distance from the tree line to the office building, wind direction, and how it would carry sound. The gravel drive and where footsteps would be audible. The warped window frame on the east side and how long it would take a man with the right approach to move through it without noise. 2 guards now, not one. The irregular one was the variable he needed to account for before he moved. He was not afraid of what he was planning to do. He had moved through harder terrain under worse conditions with less information and higher stakes. What was underneath it was something else. He had driven into Duskfield looking for silence, looking for a piece of land quiet enough that the part of him he had not yet managed to locate again might have room to surface. He had not come here looking for someone who needed help. He had not come here looking for a problem that required what he was capable of. But Frank Harlow had built 100 acres into something real, had trusted the wrong man out of the depth of his decency, and had died for it in a building he had maintained for 14 years with his own hands. And his daughter had come back here alone with a worn notebook and 11 days of careful waiting and a dead father's words that she was still trying to understand. Cole Raines looked at the fire for a long time. Then he leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to rest. And in the way he had learned in other dark places, he let the next 12 hours arrange themselves into sequence in his mind, step by step, approach by approach, contingency by contingency. Duke breathed steadily near the door. The fire held its shape. Outside, the cold pressed in from every direction, but the house was still standing, and so were the people inside it. He was up before the light. Not because he had said anything, not because sleep had been particularly generous or particularly cruel. Cole Raines woke at 4:50 in the morning, the way he had woken for 13 years, abruptly and completely, with no interval between unconscious and operational. He lay still for 3 seconds in the unfamiliar dark of the ranch house bedroom, cataloging the sounds around him. Wind against the eaves, the settling of old timber, Duke's breathing near the doorway, steady and slow. Nothing that required action. He got up, he dressed in the dark without turning on a light. Dark jeans, a charcoal thermal shirt, the worn field jacket he had carried through more climates than he could accurately list. No insignia on it anymore, just fabric and use. He pulled on his boots and laced them with the automatic precision of a man whose hands knew the task without instruction from his brain. Duke lifted his head when Cole moved into the hallway. The dog watched him pass with amber eyes that caught the faint ember light from the dying fireplace. Cole touched his hand briefly to the top of Duke's head as he went by. The dog rose and followed. In the main room, Meg was asleep on the couch, the blankets pulled to her chin, her face turned toward the back of the cushions. The worn notebook was still on the table where she had left it. Cole looked at it for a moment, then looked at her. She slept the way exhausted people sleep when they have finally allowed themselves to stop watching the door deeply and with the quality of someone whose body has taken over because their mind has run down completely. He left her there. He took his pack from beside the chair and went out the back. The pre-dawn air was sharp enough to cut. The temperature had dropped another 8 or 10 degrees overnight, and the ground was hard and white-edged with the first thin frost of the season. Cole's breath came in short, visible clouds as he stood on the back porch and let his eyes adjust fully to the darkness. The ranch spread out around him, silent and enormous, under a sky that had gone deeply clear, stars thick from horizon to horizon without the interference of any town light worth mentioning. He oriented himself from memory. The Harlow property ran north to south along a ridge that fell away to the east. The property line he was interested in was 3/4 of a mile to the northwest, where the old office building and equipment shed sat near the livestock pens that had been inactive since Frank's death. Between here and there open grassland with scattered pine clusters and 2 dry creek beds running diagonal to his intended path. He had mapped it in his mind the night before. Now he walked it. Duke moved alongside him in the darkness without a leash, staying within 6 feet, nose working continuously. The dog was reading the landscape the way Cole was reading it, building a picture from information gathered layer by layer, scent and sound, and the quality of silence that tells a trained animal whether an area has been recently disturbed or is simply empty. The ground was frozen enough to hold their prints, but not hard enough to make significant noise. Cole moved at a pace that was neither slow nor fast, just deliberate, placing his feet with the habit of someone who had spent years in environments where the wrong step had consequences he did not want to think about at 4 in the morning in Montana with his breath turning to vapor in the air around him. He stopped twice, once when Duke's nose lifted sharply and tracked left before relaxing again. Deer passing through the lower creek bed an hour or two before them. The other time when he crested a low rise and got his first clear sight line to the office building 300 yards out, a low rectangular structure with dark windows and a porch light that had long since failed. He crouched behind a cluster of juniper and watched for 20 minutes. At 5:42, a light moved near the equipment shed, a flashlight held at waist level moving in a slow, deliberate arc from the shed toward the fence line and back. The man carrying it was large, broad through the shoulders, with the rolling, unhurried gait of someone doing a job he had done enough times to do without thinking. Gus Tanner. He swept the light along the ground, checked the gate latch turned, and walked back toward the shed. Cole timed him through a full circuit. Tanner emerged again at 6:21, 39 minutes between appearances. At 6:50, something else moved. A figure stepped out from behind the back of the office building, not from the equipment shed direction, but from the northern tree line, moving toward the building's front door with a younger man's quick pace. Thin, narrow shoulders. He had a radio clipped to his belt and a coffee thermos in his right hand. He checked the front door lock with a perfunctory tug, rounded the building's east side, then disappeared back toward the tree line 10 minutes later. The truck Meg had not seen was parked just inside the northern tree line, visible only in morning light from Cole's elevated position. 2 men, Gus Tanner on a predictable 40-minute ground rotation. The second man arriving in early morning, checking the building exterior, moving on. An irregular schedule, which meant he could appear at any point. That was the variable Cole needed to understand and account for before he went in. He watched through a second complete sequence of both men's movements. He mapped the blind spots the northwest corner of the office building where neither man's route passed. The creek approach from the west where the drainage berm provided cover for the final 40 yards. The window on the east side that Meg had told him about. Cole watched 3 full rotations before he moved back. By the time he returned to the ranch house, the sky was gray-pink at the eastern edge, and Meg was awake sitting at the kitchen table with her hands around a mug, looking at nothing in particular. She had washed her face, her hair was pulled back. She looked like someone who had made a private decision overnight and arrived at the morning steadier for it. She did not ask him where he had been. He poured coffee from the pot she had made and sat across from her. Two men, he said. Gus Tanner does a 40-minute rotation. He's consistent. The second man comes from the northern tree line, irregular timing. Checks the building exterior and moves on. He parks out of sight. Meg's hands tightened slightly around her mug. I only saw him twice. I wasn't sure if he was regular. He's not regular, that's the problem. Cole looked at his coffee. I need one more day of observation before I go in. I need to understand when the second man is least likely to appear. She nodded. What do you know about him, from what you saw? Young, moves fast, carries a radio. He's paying more attention than Tanner is. Cole looked at the window. Tanner is clocking hours. The other one is actually watching. He spent the day on the property. He repaired a section of fence along the south pasture that had come down in a recent windstorm, working with tools he found in the barn, doing it because it needed doing, and because physical work cleared the kind of thinking that got in its own way when it ran idle. Duke moved around the perimeter while he worked, ranging out and coming back checking in. In the afternoon, he walked the western approach to the Wade property, again at different hours, confirming his sight lines, checking where the ground was hard and where it went soft near the creek bed, noting the drainage berm that would give him cover for the final approach. He made two observations. The second man appeared at 10 in the morning and again at 6 in the evening, a rough schedule after all, irregular in appearance but bookending the day. That gave him a window. At dusk, Cole came in and ate what Meg had put together from the limited pantry and said it was good because it was. Duke ate from the bag Cole kept in the truck and then settled near the door. When the clock on the kitchen wall read 9:15, Cole stood. He put on the field jacket. He transferred the multi-tool from his pack to his inside pocket. He fitted a small pen light into his left palm and tested it twice. He checked his boots. He looked at Duke and the dog was already standing. Meg stayed at the table. She did not say be careful. She did not ask him to check in. She was the daughter of a man who had maintained a generator every week for 14 years without being asked, and she understood what it looked like when someone was prepared to do something without requiring reassurance. If it's not there, she said, we consider what else we have, Cole said. But it's there. He went out the back. The night was colder than the one before it. The frost had deepened and the ground was harder under his boots as he moved through it the same western approach, the same path he had walked twice in daylight, now rendered in darkness and memorized terrain. Duke moved at his left shoulder close enough that Cole could feel the warmth of the dog's body when the wind dropped. They crossed the first creek bed without slowing. The second one took more care, the ground softer here on the north bank, and Cole placed his feet on the edges where the frost had hardened the surface sufficiently to avoid marking it clearly. Duke picked his way through with the precision of a dog who understood that what he left behind him was information. At the juniper cluster, Cole stopped and watched. The light from Gus Tanner's flashlight was moving along the fence line to the east, tracking the familiar arc. Cole counted. The man was on the back half of his circuit, 14 minutes roughly, until he came back around to the equipment shed and started again. The second man had made his evening appearance at 6 and had not returned. His morning appearance had been at 10. Cole had a window. They moved when the light was farthest from the building. Across the open ground in a low-controlled run, not sprinting but fast enough that the crossing took less than 90 seconds until they reached the east wall of the office building and pressed against it. Cole put his back to the wood siding and breathed. Duke pressed beside him, body warm against Cole's left leg. The east window was exactly where Meg had said. The wooden frame was swollen and warped at the bottom left corner, the gap visible even in darkness to someone who knew to look for it. Cole worked the frame, slowly testing pressure at the corners, finding where the resistance was least. He applied even lateral force and felt the frame shift. He moved it in increments, half an inch at a time, waiting between each movement for the sound to settle. It took 4 minutes to open the window far enough. He went in first. Duke came in behind him with a silence that would have been impressive in a dog half his size. Inside, the air was cold and stale. Cole switched on the pen light and held it low-angled at the floor. The office materialized around him in fragments, the wooden desk to his right, papers stacked in approximate order, suggesting someone had gone through and reorganized them. The filing cabinet along the south wall with one drawer slightly open, the corkboard above the side table still pinned with ranch maps and grazing rotation schedules in Frank Harlow's hand. Cole looked up. The smoke detector casing was mounted on the ceiling directly above the meeting area, slightly left of center. Older plastic yellowed at the edges, the kind of fixture that becomes invisible through familiarity. Cole positioned a chair beneath it quietly. He climbed up, put his pen light in his mouth, and examined the casing with both hands. His fingers found the quarter-turn release at the base. He applied gentle rotational pressure. The casing came free. He brought it down carefully and opened it with the multi-tool, using the flathead to work the interior clip. The device inside was small, matte black, the size of a lighter. He turned it in his fingers and found the micro SD card seated in its slot, flush and undisturbed. No one had touched it. No one had known to look. Cole allowed himself exactly one measured breath. Then Duke went rigid. Not a growl, not a sound at all. Just the absolute physical stillness the dog produced when something had entered the threshold of his awareness that had not been there a moment before. Cole extinguished the pen light instantly and was off the chair into the side of the window in 3 steps. Footsteps on gravel. Close. Getting closer. Gus Tanner had cut his rotation short. Forgotten something changed his mind. It did not matter why. What mattered was that he was 30 feet from the office door and walking toward it. The flashlight beam swung across the window frame. Cole had the SD card in the protective sleeve from his pack and the sleeve in his inner jacket pocket before the beam completed its arc. He replaced the empty camera housing in the ceiling mount by feel in the dark quarter turn back into position and stepped away from the chair. He put the chair back where he had found it without sound. Duke had not moved. He was watching Cole with the focused attention of a boy waiting for the signal that defined what happened next. The footsteps stopped outside the east window. "Thought I heard something," Gus Tanner said, to himself or to someone on a radio. His voice was low and unhurried, not particularly alarmed, just noting a detail. Cole moved toward the rear exit at the back of the building. He found it by memory and by the faint seam of cold air coming through the gap at the bottom. He worked the interior latch, eased it back, and pushed the door open with 2 fingers at the hinge edge where it was least likely to complain. The hinge creaked anyway. Outside, Gus's flashlight swung. "Hey, who's there?" Cole went through the door. He ran low and fast toward the tree line to the west, 20 yards of open ground between the door and the first pines. Duke was at his flank, matching his pace stride for stride. Behind them, Gus Tanner's boots hit the back corner of the building and his flashlight swept wide. "There," Gus said. Not panicked. Matter of fact, a man who had spotted something and was calling it in. He lifted the radio from his belt. Cole heard the radio crackle as he reached the tree line. The second man had an earpiece. That was how he monitored from a distance. Cole filed it without breaking stride and drove deeper into the pines, angling north toward the creek bed he had mapped 2 days earlier. Duke peeled left without being told, cutting a wide arc through the brush and doubling back, circling to confuse the scent trail. Cole continued straight, running by instinct and terrain memory for 40 yards before shifting to a controlled jog. The flashlight behind him was moving into the trees, but moving slowly, a man not trained for pursuit doing his best in the dark. No second flashlight appeared from the northern tree line. The second guard had not arrived yet. Cole had made his window correctly. Duke materialized at his left side, breathing measured coat, dark in the darkness. The dog had completed his circle and come back, finding Cole by scent and direction without effort. Cole moved north until he found the creek bed. He stepped into it, ankle-deep cold that cut through his boots immediately, and walked upstream for 60 yards before stepping out on the opposite bank. Duke followed water running off his coat. Behind them, the creek break would scatter their scent and erase whatever track they had left in the soft earth. After 5 minutes, the sound of Tanner's movement in the trees fell away. After 10, there was nothing behind them at all except wind. Cole and Duke moved through the dark at a careful pace, using the terrain rather than fighting it, until the lights of the Harlow ranch house appeared ahead in the distance, pale and steady through the kitchen window. By the time they came through the back door, the first thin drops of rain had started to fall. Meg stood up from the table when the door opened. She looked at Cole's wet boots and the leaves caught in Duke's coat, and the set of his expression, which was not satisfied or triumphant, but simply resolved the face of a man who had gone to do something and done it. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and held up the protective sleeve. She sat back down, slowly, like something had gone out of her legs. Duke shook water across the kitchen floor and then walked to his place near the door and lay down with a long, measured exhale. Cole set the sleeve on the table. He pulled his jacket off and hung it on the chair back. Then he sat down, opened his pack, and removed the compact laptop and the card reader he had brought with him, because he had known when he packed the truck 3 days ago in a different state with a different plan that he might need them for something, though he had not known what. He inserted the card, the device registered, files appeared on the screen time-stamped, and dated the most recent from 4 weeks and 2 days ago. Cole opened it. The footage was grainy, not unusable. The wide-angle lens had captured the desk in the sitting area, and the wall cabinet and the timestamp in the lower right corner ran in white numerals that were clear and precise. Meg leaned forward slowly as the image loaded her hands flat on the table. Frank Harlow walked into frame. She made no sound. Her hands did not move. But something happened behind her eyes. A compression, like a held breath taken at a moment that required absolute stillness, and Cole looked at the screen and not at her, because some things a person needs to meet alone, even when they are not alone. Frank Harlow was a broad man with silver-streaked hair and the careful, deliberate movements of someone who spent his days in physical work. He wore his work jacket dark canvas with a torn cuff, and he moved through the office with the ease of long familiarity. He was at his desk when Wade Colton came in. Wade entered from the left side of frame. He was well-dressed for a ranch meeting, a button-down shirt, clean boots, the confident posture of a man who understood the social weight of appearance. He sat in the chair across the desk from Frank with the relaxed ease of someone who has not yet registered that the conversation is not going to go the way he expects it to. Then it did not go the way he expected. Frank spoke first, evenly without theater. He laid out the discrepancies he had found line by line, the same way a man reads a repair list before deciding what needs to be fixed. Wade listened with the careful expression of someone managing a response before the question has fully landed. Then Wade denied it. Clean, complete, unreserved denial. He blamed the accounting firm. He blamed data entry. He said the word clerical twice. He said the word confusion. He smiled while he said it. Cole watched the smile and recognized it for what it was, not warmth, not comfort, but the social tool of a man who had built a long career on other people's instinct to believe what a friendly face tells them. Frank did not smile back. He stood. He said something that the recording captured only partially, the camera's microphone limited at that distance. But what came through clearly was the word bank and the word morning, and the flat declarative quality of a man who had made a decision and was announcing it rather than proposing it. Then Wade Colton leaned across the desk. What he said came through with complete clarity. "If you go to the bank tomorrow," Wade said, "you will regret it." No ambiguity, no softening. The words of a man who had moved past persuasion into territory he had not planned to enter this early in the conversation, but was not retreating from. Frank pointed at the door. He walked out of frame. His footsteps crossed the room and the door opened and closed, and then the office was empty except for Wade Colton, who remained standing at the desk with an expression that Cole had seen in various forms on various faces in various countries, the expression of a man who has just heard a door close on the version of events he preferred. Wade moved to the desk. He opened the center drawer and removed a document folder. He crossed to the wall cabinet, opened it, and took out a laminated sheet, the generator shed blueprint, visible clearly enough in the footage. Wade looked at it for a moment, folded it, and placed it inside his jacket. Then he reached into the drawer again and removed something small that the camera's resolution was not sufficient to identify. He put it in his coat pocket. He stood in the empty office for a moment longer. Then he took out his phone. He made a call. He spoke briefly. The microphone caught fragments, the audio compromised by distance and angle. But two things came through with unmistakable clarity. A first name, partial but distinct. It began with a hard G, the kind of name that belonged to a man older than Wade, a working man's name, someone local, and a sentence, 7 words spoken with the flat certainty of a man issuing instructions he had already planned. "Tonight," Wade Colton said into his phone, "exactly like we discussed." The recording ended. The timestamp in the corner of the final frame read 2043. Cole had already done the calculation. The generator shed exploded at 21:47. 64 minutes after that call, he looked at Meg. She had not moved from the position she had taken when Frank walked into frame. Her hands were still flat on the table. Her eyes were dry, which was a more difficult thing to achieve than crying would have been. And Cole understood that she had spent the weeks since her father's death working to maintain exactly this kind of steadiness, and that it had cost her more than anything she had let him see. "He didn't do it alone," she said. Her voice was level. "No. There's someone else." "Yes," Wade looked at the frozen final frame. The first name from the call. It starts with a hard G. Someone local. Someone Wade could reach at 9 o'clock on a weeknight and give instructions to without explanation. Meg was still for a moment, then slowly, carefully, Gus. Cole looked at her. "Gus Tanner," she said. "He's local. He needed money. Wade hired him 3 months ago, which means Wade had already been planning to keep someone on the property. What if the arrangement started earlier? What if Gus wasn't just hired to watch the property after my father died?" Cole closed the laptop gently. He sat back and let that sit. Then his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. Unknown number. He did not answer it. 3 minutes later, it buzzed again. A text message from a deputy at the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office, a routine contact he had been given when he registered the property transfer. Wade Colton had filed a criminal complaint, trespassing and theft of private property. Cole's name and vehicle description were in the filing. The deputy's message was brief, professional, and not unkind. He suggested Cole make himself available. Cole read the message twice. Then he set the phone on the table. Meg had watched his face while he read it. "Wade. Moving faster than I expected," Cole said. "A man who moves this quickly to law enforcement after a nighttime intruder has taken something from his secured property, knows exactly what was in that building and exactly what was taken. A man with nothing to hide does not make a criminal complaint at midnight. A man with something specific to hide does." "What happens to you?" Meg said directly. "Nothing I can't manage," Cole said, "but I need to move before his complaint gains traction." He picked up his phone and found the number he had written down from the property transfer documentation. Not the deputy, the other number, the one listed under County Law Enforcement Direct Line. Sheriff Walt Dugan. Cole knew very little about Walt Dugan. The name had appeared in county records as a 12-year incumbent, which meant the man had won 3 elections in a county where trust was not extended without reason. It meant he had managed to keep his position through the particular political turbulence of rural Montana without making the kind of enemies that end careers, which itself said something about how he operated. Cole called the number at 6 in the morning. It rang twice. "Dugan," the voice said. Not surprised, not groggy. The voice of a man who had been awake for some time and was waiting for whatever the morning chose to bring. Cole identified himself. He said he had something the sheriff needed to see and that it was time-sensitive. A pause. "I know who you are," Dugan said. Wade Colton's complaint came across my desk at midnight. Another pause shorter. I've also been waiting for something connected to Frank Harlow's death for the better part of 2 years. You got something solid. Cole looked at the laptop, at the sleeve that had held the card. Yes. Then come in, Dugan said. Bring whatever you've got. I'll deal with the complaint. Cole put the phone down and looked at Meg across the table. She had her hands around her coffee mug again. She was watching him with the steady green eyes of a woman who had spent 11 days alone in a cold house, running on nothing but the conviction that her father had not died the way they said he did. Sheriff Dugan, Cole said. We're going to see him this morning. She nodded. She did not look relieved. She looked like someone who has been waiting for a door to open and is now calculating what might be on the other side of it. There's something you should know, Cole said. Dugan said he's been waiting for something connected to your father for 2 years. Meg was still for a moment. He already suspected. He had no proof. He had a direction and no destination. She looked at the laptop. At the footage still visible on the screen in its final frame, Wade Colton is back to the camera, heading for the door, the timestamp frozen at 2043. My father built this whole case by himself, she said quietly. In 6 weeks, with a camera the size of a matchbox. Cole said nothing. He let the statement be what it was. Duke got up from his place near the door and walked to Meg's side. He put his head against her arm, just for a moment, a brief and uncalculated gesture of the kind that required no training and no command. Outside, the rain had eased. The Montana sky was moving toward the flat gray of early morning after weather, and through the kitchen window, the first faint suggestion of daylight was pressing up from the horizon. Cole picked up the laptop and the card sleeve and put them in the pack. It was time to go. Sheriff Walt Dugan's office was not what Cole had expected, which told him something about how often expectations served as a reliable guide to anything. He had anticipated the particular institutional beige of county law enforcement fluorescent lighting and laminate furniture, and the faint smell of burnt coffee that had become a kind of unofficial signature of American bureaucracy. What he found instead was a room that looked like it had been used seriously for a long time by a man who took his work seriously, which was a different thing entirely. The desk was heavy oak scarred at the edges. The walls carried framed maps of Gallatin County at different scales annotated in pencil in ways that suggested active use rather than decoration. A single window behind the desk looked out onto the main street of Dustfield, and the light coming through it was the flat, clean light of a morning after rain, the kind of light that made everything look slightly more honest than it did in other conditions. Walt Dugan was standing when they came in. He was 52 years old and built like a man who had done physical work for most of his life and had not stopped doing it simply because his job had shifted toward paperwork. He was lean through the shoulders and weathered in the face with deep lines at the corners of his eyes, and a silver mustache trimmed with the kind of precision that suggested personal standards rather than vanity. He wore a tan uniform jacket slightly worn at both elbows. His Stetson was on the hat rack by the door. His eyes were the pale brown of creek water in late summer, and they moved to Cole first, then to Meg, then to Duke, and then back to Cole in a single unhurried circuit that took in everything and displayed nothing. He gestured at the 2 chairs across from the desk. Sit down, he said. Duke went to the corner and lay down facing the door. Dugan glanced at the dog. Trained, he said. It was not a question. Yes, Cole said. Dugan nodded once, as though this confirmed something he had already assessed, and sat down behind the desk. He did not make a production of the moment. He was not the kind of man who performed authority because he was not the kind of man who felt the absence of it. Cole set the laptop on the desk and opened it. He inserted the card reader and loaded the footage without narration. He let the footage speak first because he had found across years of briefings and conversations in high-stakes rooms that the discipline of not explaining before the evidence has been seen was one of the most undervalued forms of respect you could offer another person's intelligence. Dugan watched the entire recording without speaking. He leaned forward slightly when Wade Colton leaned across the desk. His jaw tightened at the 7 words that came through clearly. When the footage stopped, he sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. Timestamp puts that call at 8:43, he said. Yes, Cole said. Generator shed went at 9:47. 64 minutes. Dugan looked at Meg. His expression was careful and without performance. Miss Harlow, I want you to know that the investigation into your father's death was not closed because anyone in this office believed the findings were complete. It was closed because the findings were what they were and what they gave us no legal basis to continue. I want you to understand the difference. Meg met his gaze. I understand the difference, she said. I also understand it doesn't change what happened. No, Dugan said. It doesn't. He looked at the screen for another moment, then at Cole. Wade's complaint is on my desk. Trespassing and theft. He filed it last night through his attorney. I know, Cole said. You went into a secured building on property that legally belongs to Wade Colton, and you removed an item from that building. I did. Dugan was quiet. He looked at the card reader. He looked at the frozen final frame on the screen. What you removed was evidence in a potential homicide investigation that had been unknowingly left unsecured on a property that was itself obtained through potentially fraudulent means following the death of the victim. He said it carefully, the way a man reads a document he is simultaneously composing. That's a complicated legal position. I'm aware, Cole said. It's complicated in ways that may work in your favor depending on how the next 48 hours develop. Dugan stood. He moved to the window and stood with his hands in his jacket pockets looking out at the street. I've had my eye on Wade Colton for 23 months. Not for this specifically, for land acquisition irregularities in this county. 3 properties in 2 years that came to him through estate sales under conditions that didn't sit right. The legal mechanisms were clean enough that I couldn't move on them. The pattern wasn't clean, but pattern isn't probable cause. He turned from the window. This is probable cause. He was looking at Cole when he said it, but he was also looking past Cole at something he had been building toward for a long time that had finally acquired the shape of something actionable. I need 48 hours, Dugan said. I need to get Detective Maddox out to the generator shed for a formal forensic review under the framework of a reopened investigation. I need to pull Wade's phone records and his financial records through proper channels. I need to do this right because if we do it wrong, it doesn't stick. And if it doesn't stick, Wade Colton walks out of a courtroom and goes back to doing what he does to the next person who trusts him. He looked at Meg when he said the last part. She did not look away. Where will you be? Dugan said to Cole. The ranch. Stay there, he paused. I'll deal with the complaint. He looked at them both once more. Then he sat down, reached for his phone, and began to dial. Cole and Meg left him there in the clean morning light, already making the calls that the next 48 hours required. Detective Claire Maddox arrived at the generator shed site the following morning with the focused economical energy of someone who had been doing this work long enough to know exactly where to start and precisely how much noise to make while doing it. She was in her late 30s, compact and athletic in build, with dark hair pulled into a low bun at the nape of her neck. A thin scar crossed her left eyebrow, a pale line that had faded with time but had not disappeared. She wore gloves and carried a kit that she set down in the debris field without ceremony and opened with the practiced ease of a surgeon laying out instruments. Cole and Meg stood at the perimeter. Duke sat beside them, eyes moving across the site with the habitual vigilance of a dog who understood that his job included information gathering even when the situation did not require his direct participation. Maddox worked without speaking for the first 20 minutes. She moved through the debris in a grid pattern, photographing each section before touching it, crouching low over certain points and straightening without comment. She thought through her hands as much as through her mind, her fingers doing the work of assessment as she moved along the bent and blackened remnants of the shed's infrastructure. She stopped at the pressure valve assembly. She crouched. She looked at it for a long time without touching it. Then she put on a second glove and tilted the assembly toward the light with two careful fingers. "This isn't fatigue failure," she said. She said it the way someone says a thing they had suspected before they came and are now confirming, not dramatically, just cleanly. "Fatigue failure looks different. The metal fractures in a pattern that follows stress over time. What I'm looking at is mechanical intervention. This valve was adjusted manually, recently, before the failure event." Dugan stood beside her. "Tool marks." "Yes." She pointed to the valve housing. "Contact pattern here and here. That's from a specialty adjustable wrench. The contact angle is inconsistent with the standard maintenance tools for this type of equipment." She looked up. "This shed would have had a standard kit, right? The kind the owner used for regular maintenance." Meg spoke from the perimeter. "My father kept everything organized. He had a specific kit for the generator. He'd used the same tools for 12 years. Maddox stood and made a note. "I'll need to see that kit." When they found it in the barn, exactly where Frank had always kept it, hanging on the pegboard above the workbench, each tool in its designated position. Maddox compared the wrench head sizes to the contact marks on the valve housing and did not need to say the result aloud. The discrepancy was visible to everyone present. She requested the warrant for Wade Colton's property that afternoon. Dugan had it signed by the following morning. The specialty adjustable wrench was in the second shelf of Wade's equipment storage between a pipe cutter and a pressure gauge calibration tool. It had been wiped down but not cleaned thoroughly, and the oil residue remaining in the serrations of the head was consistent under preliminary analysis with the grade of generator oil used in the Harlow Ranch unit. Maddox bagged it without expression. She handed it to the deputy behind her and pulled off her gloves. "That's your physical connection," she said. While Maddox worked the shed site, Dugan's office executed the second part of the warrant, Wade's financial records. A county financial investigator worked through 2 days of documentation and surfaced what Frank Harlow had already found in handwritten notebooks. Systematic diversion of cattle sale revenues to accounts registered under a shell company that traced back to a private address in Billings, registered in a name that was not Wade Colton, but belonged to his brother-in-law. 8 months of transfers. The total exceeded $60,000. The records matched Meg's notebook entries with a precision that confirmed Frank Harlow had been right about every number he had circled. It was on the third day, while Cole was replacing the broken latch on the barn's east door, that Dugan called. Cole had been working since early morning, the kind of work that needed doing regardless of everything else. Duke was stationed at the corner of the barn, watching the drive with the unhurried attention of a dog who had nothing specific to look for and was therefore looking for everything. Cole's phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. He set down the wrench and answered. "The phone records came back," Dugan said. "The call Wade made at 8:43 the night Frank Harlow died. We traced the number." Cole waited. "Gus Tanner," Dugan said. Cole was still for a moment, not surprised exactly, but confirmed. "Tanner." Wade called Tanner that night and told him to come check the east fence line at 9 o'clock. Said there'd been reports of a loose gate and he wanted someone on site. A pause. Tanner showed up. He was there when the shed exploded. He's the reason the coroner's report describes Frank as conducting a routine evening inspection. Tanner told the investigators he saw Frank heading toward the generator shed around 9. He didn't know it wasn't true. He was just reporting what he'd been positioned to see. Cole looked across the drive to where Meg was hanging laundry on the back line, her back to him, her movement slow and ordinary in the morning light. "Tanner wasn't part of the plan," Cole said. "No," Dugan said. "Wade used him as scenery, gave him a reason to be there, a reason to report what he saw, a reason to become a piece of evidence that Wade didn't have to fabricate himself. Tanner's not a suspect. He's a witness who was manipulated." "Have you told him?" "Brought him in this morning." A longer pause. "He sat in the chair across from me for 5 minutes without saying anything. Then he asked me if Frank Harlow had died in that shed. I told him yes. He asked me if he was the one who put Frank there by telling investigators he'd seen Frank walking toward the building. Dugan's voice was even. I told him he told the truth about what he saw. I told him the lie was in why he saw it. He didn't find that particularly comforting. It's not particularly comforting, Cole said. No, Dugan agreed. But he signed the statement. He's confirmed the call from Wade, confirmed the instructions he was given, confirmed the timing. That goes into the file along with the footage, the physical evidence from Maddox, and the financial records. Cole leaned against the barn wall. Above him, the sky was the hard, clear blue of late autumn in Montana, the kind of blue that had no softness in it, just depth and distance and the particular honesty of a sky that made no promises about what was coming. One more thing, Dugan said. Harlan Fitch came in voluntarily this morning. He'd heard the investigation had reopened. He brought his own documentation, the original invoice for the camera unit, the installation date, written notes he had kept about the conversation he had with Frank when Frank first came to him. He was prepared to testify to the purpose of the device and the circumstances of its installation. A pause. He said Frank told him word for word that he needed to document what was happening before someone decided to make the problem disappear. Cole let that sit for a moment. Frank Harlow had been more deliberate than even Meg had known. He had not just installed a camera, he had created a paper trail for the camera itself through a witness who had kept independent records. When, Cole said. This afternoon, Dugan said. I want you and Miss Harlow at the office by 4. We'll do this properly. Cole put the phone down and looked across the drive at Meg, who had stopped at the laundry line and was watching him with the still attention of someone who can read a person's posture from 40 yards. He walked toward her. He told her about Tanner, about the financial records, about Harlan Fitch walking in voluntarily with his own documentation about what Frank had said to Harlan when he first came asking for the camera. He told her all of it in the same measured way he had received it, without amplifying and without diminishing, and he watched her face move through each piece of information with the careful steadiness of someone who had been carrying a weight for a long time and was now being shown piece by piece that the weight had always had the shape of truth. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Harlan kept records, she said. It was not a question. It was what it sounded like, a woman absorbing the fact that her father's methodical nature had extended further than she knew had been understood, and matched by an old man in a flannel shirt who had once done classified work in places nobody talked about. Yes, Cole said. She turned back to the laundry line. She reached up and unclipped a shirt that had dried in the morning wind. Her movements were steady and deliberate. My father trusted the right people, she said. He just didn't know it in time. Cole said nothing. He let the statement be what it was. Wade Colton's house was on the western edge of Dusk Field, set back from the road behind a line of cottonwoods that had lost most of their leaves to the October wind. It was a substantial house, well-maintained, with a deep front porch and exterior lighting that came on at dusk in the automatic way of a home whose owner valued the appearance of order. The drive was gravel, freshly raked. The flower beds along the foundation were turned over and mulched for winter, tended with the kind of care that communicated something about the person inside. Cole and Meg waited in Dugan's vehicle on the road while the sheriff and 2 deputies went up the drive. Wade was on the porch when they arrived. Cole watched through the windshield. Wade Colton was dressed in dark trousers and a navy sweater. His hands in his pockets, his posture carrying the particular stillness of a man who had made a decision about how this moment was going to go and was committed to it. He was 47 years old, and he looked it in a way that was not weakness, clean-jawed and sharp-featured, and composed in a manner that had served him well for a long time in rooms where composure was currency. He watched Dugan come up the porch steps without moving. Cole could not hear what was said from the distance of the road. He watched the exchange in the compressed, removed way of someone observing something significant from a position that does not allow participation. Dugan spoke. Wade listened. Something shifted behind Wade's face, a tightening that was the first visible evidence that the surface had a limit. Wade turned his head and looked toward the vehicle on the road. He was too far away for Cole to read his expression with precision. But Cole had seen men in the moment when the thing they had been doing finally found them, had seen it in various countries under various circumstances, and what he saw in the angle of Wade Colton's body and the direction of his attention was the specific recognition of a man identifying the source of what has arrived. Wade said something. Dugan responded. A deputy moved to Wade's side. Wade did not resist. He allowed his hands to be moved from his pockets and placed behind his back with the controlled acceptance of a man who had decided that his next move required a different room and different legal instruments. The handcuffs went on with the flat mechanical sound that carried faintly even to the road. The deputy guided him toward the cruiser. Wade passed it on the driver's side, and for a moment his face was fully visible through the windshield lit by the late afternoon light. His expression was not the expression of a man who had been caught. It was the expression of a man who was calculating even now what options remained in the territory ahead of him. Cole met his eyes through the glass. Wade looked at him for 3 seconds. Then the deputy moved him forward, and he was gone. Meg was looking at her hands in her lap. She had watched the whole thing, and she was looking at her hands now the way you look at something familiar when you need the ground to be still beneath you. Cole said nothing. He let the moment be what it was. Some things are large enough that comment would impose a smaller shape on them than they deserve, and this was one of those things. After a time, she looked up. Is it enough? She said. Yes, Cole said. Not a reassurance, not a comfort, a factual assessment from a man who had spent his adult life making factual assessments in conditions where getting them wrong had permanent consequences. He had reviewed the evidence. He had heard Maddox's analysis. He had listened to Dugan's accounting of what the phone records established and what Tanner's statement confirmed and what Harlan Fitch had brought in voluntarily. He had watched the footage enough times to understand it at the level of detail a legal case requires. The footage showing threat and premeditation. The physical evidence connecting Wade's tools to the tampered valve. The financial records confirming 8 months of systematic fraud that documented motive. Tanner's statement establishing Wade's movements the night of the explosion. Harlan Fitch's records establishing the camera's purpose and provenance. Meg's own notebooks establishing 3 weeks of documented observation that would corroborate the larger pattern. It was enough. The first blizzard hit before Thanksgiving. It arrived not with warning so much as with inevitability. The way Montana winter always arrived, as though it had never actually left, but had simply been waiting at the edge of the mountains for the calendar to give it permission. The temperature dropped 18 degrees in 4 hours. The snow began as a manageable afternoon fall, soft and almost decorative, the kind of snow that requires very little of anyone. By nightfall, it was moving sideways, driven by a wind that found every gap in every structure on the ranch and communicated its presence clearly. Cole was already outside when it turned serious. He had seen the shift in the cloud pattern at 3 in the afternoon and had spent the following 2 hours preparing for what he knew was coming. He secured the barn doors with additional bracing, checked the waterline heating cables, redistributed the hay to ensure the cattle could access feed without crossing the sections most exposed to wind. He worked with the systematic focus of someone who understood that preparation and crisis are not two different events, but one event experienced in different sequences depending on which comes first. Duke worked beside him through all of it. The dog moved through the barn with the unhurried purpose of an animal who had decided that this situation required his full participation and was providing it. When one of the younger cattle shifted nervously near the east gate, Duke moved between it and the open space and held his position with a quiet authority that settled the animal in a way that shouting and waving would not have. It was not aggression. It was the kind of certainty that some creatures communicate through stillness rather than force. Cole watched it from across the barn and noted it the way he noted everything Duke did with the attention it deserved. By 10 that night, the storm was at its full strength. The ranch house held. The windows flexed, but did not fail. The fire Cole had built before dark was producing steady heat, and the stack of wood he had moved inside that afternoon was sufficient for the night. Meg had found supplies in the pantry that Cole had not noticed and had made something from them that was plain and hot and adequate, which was the standard that mattered. They sat at the kitchen table while the storm pressed against every wall of the house. Simultaneously, the sound of it, continuous and enormous, and ate without speaking much, because there was not a great deal to say, and what there was did not require the storm as backdrop. "The cattle will be all right," Cole said. "I know," Meg said. "You made sure of that." He looked at his plate. "My father used to say that a ranch doesn't test your patience," she said. "It tests your attention. It finds out whether you're paying attention to the right things at the right time." He said most problems on a ranch aren't problems. They're things that were already happening that someone stopped paying attention to. Cole considered this. He was right. He usually was. She set down her fork. "About most things, just not about Wade." Cole looked up. He knew Wade wasn't perfect, she said. He didn't expect perfect. He expected loyalty. He thought loyalty was something you could earn in a person by treating them with enough consistent decency. She was quiet for a moment. He wasn't wrong about that as a general principle. He was just wrong about Wade specifically. "Some people take what's offered and spend it," Cole said. "It's not a flaw in the offering. It's a flaw in the person." She looked at him for a moment. "Is that what happened to you in the service?" The question was direct and asked without apology, the way she asked most things, without the soft preamble that people often use to cushion questions they were uncertain they had the right to ask. Cole was quiet. He thought about it with the genuine consideration it deserved, rather than reaching for the standard answer, which was available but not quite accurate. "No," he said finally. "What happened to me in the service was different. I gave what I had, and I used what was given to me, and I did the job I said I would do. What happened was that I did it for long enough that I used up the version of myself that knew how to stop." He looked at the fire. When you do the same thing intensely enough for long enough, you lose the ability to locate the self that exists outside of it. "I left the service 18 months ago, and I still couldn't find that person. That's why I came here, not to this ranch specifically, just to somewhere far enough away from everything I'd been that maybe there was room to be something else." Meg was listening with the quality of attention that she brought to most things, complete and without performance. "Did you find it?" she said. Cole looked at the table, at his hands, at the kitchen light and the sound of the storm outside and the weight of Duke breathing steadily in his corner. "Working on it," he said. "The wolves came in January. Duke knew before anyone else. He had been doing his afternoon perimeter check along the fence line when his posture shifted in the way Cole had learned to recognize, not alarm exactly, but elevation. Every sense moved to the top of its register and held there. He stood at the western fence and tested the air with an unhurried thoroughness that suggested he had found something significant and was taking his time understanding it. Cole came out with his rifle, not to hunt, to communicate. The tracks were visible in the snow along the outer edge of the pasture, large and deliberate and recent overlapping, where the animals had walked single file through drifted snow to minimize effort. Cole counted at least 3 distinct track patterns, possibly 4. At dusk, the howling started from the ridge. Low and rolling, it came across the frozen pasture and bounced off the barn walls. The cattle shifted inside with a collective nervous energy that communicated their awareness of the sound even through walls and distance. Cole lit lanterns and positioned them along the perimeter fence, throwing light across the open ground in both directions from the gate. It was a deterrent measure rather than a solution, purchasing time and discomfort rather than resolution. At 11:40, Duke moved. He had been sitting in the snow near the fence line for 2 hours with the patience of an animal who understood that waiting was not inactivity. When the two gray shapes separated from the darkness at the edge of the pasture light, he was already on his feet and moving along the fence in a controlled arc, positioning himself between the shapes and the barn. He barked once. A single sound, short in carrying and absolutely unambiguous in its meaning. The shape stopped. Cole raised the rifle and fired once into the sky above the tree line. The sound cracked across the frozen pasture and came back diminished but still clear. The gray shapes turned and moved back into the darkness at a pace that was neither panic nor indifference. Just the measured withdrawal of animals who had found the calculation had shifted against them. Duke watched them go. He tracked their departure with his nose and his eyes until there was nothing more to track. Then he turned and came back to Cole's side, his coat carrying snow along the ridge of his back, his breath coming in even visible clouds in the frozen air. Good, Cole said quietly. He put his hand on the dog's head for a moment. Duke pressed up slightly into the contact, acknowledging it, and then looked back toward the tree line with the continued attention of a dog who had resolved a problem but had not decided the problem was finished. The gas discovery came in late January. Meg had been using the old storm cellar beneath the ranch house to store emergency supplies, the kind of preparatory habit her father had instilled, and that she had maintained even in the weeks when maintaining anything had felt beside the point. One evening, she moved toward the cellar stairs with a lantern. Duke stopped at the top of the steps. He did not follow. He stood at the doorframe and began pawing at the wood, a sharp, insistent movement, accompanied by a sound Cole had not heard from him, before a high-pitched urgency that was different from his working vocabulary in a way that was immediately recognizable as alarm. Cole crossed the kitchen in 4 steps. He crouched at the cellar entrance and inhaled. Faint. But there, propane leaking from the backup heater line pulled in the cold air below. He reached past Meg and took the lantern from her hand before she could descend. He found the exterior shut-off valve closed. It propped the cellar door open to ventilate and kept everyone out for 20 minutes. Duke remained at the top of the cellar stairs until the air cleared tense and watchful. When Cole confirmed the space was safe and said so, the dog turned and walked back to his corner with the unhurried composure of an animal who had done what was required and considered the matter resolved. Cole looked at the closed shut-off valve. He looked at the lantern in his hand. He did not say what they both understood, which was that if Duke had not stopped at the top of those stairs, the outcome of the evening would have been something neither of them wanted to think about clearly. He knew, Meg said. He always knows, Cole said. He set the lantern on the kitchen table. We'll get the line inspected in the morning. The nights were the hardest part. Not the cold and not the work and not the isolation, which was not isolation exactly because there were 2 people and a dog in a house, and that changes the mathematics of aloneness in ways that are difficult to quantify, but unmistakable in practice. The nights were hard because of what they contain. Cole woke at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday in January in the ranch house bedroom with his heart already running hard, and the ceiling above him, not the ceiling it was supposed to be, not wood and old plaster, but the sand-colored underside of a structure in a country where the light came in sideways at the wrong angle, and the sound underneath the silence was the wrong sound, and everything was the wrong temperature. He sat up. He pressed his back to the headboard. He made himself breathe deliberately in through the nose. 4 counts, hold out through the mouth. 4 counts, the technical process of returning to the present through mechanical means when the emotional means had failed. Duke was on the bed before the second breath cycle. He was not supposed to be on the bed. Cole had established this as a rule early on when the dog was young, because box on beds created certain habits that complicated field deployment. Duke knew the rule. He also knew with the precision of an animal who had spent years reading Cole's physiological state as primary information that the rule did not apply right now. He climbed up and lay across Cole's legs. Then he shifted forward and put his weight against Cole's chest, not heavy, but present, a warm, specific mass that occupied exactly the amount of space required to locate the present moment in the body, rather than leaving the body to locate itself in the past. Cole put his hand on Duke's back. The breathing steadied. He lay there in the dark with the dog's warmth against him and listened to the wind move around the corners of the ranch house and felt the quality of the dark, which was the dark of a place that had been here before he arrived and would be here when he left the settled, unconcerned dark of a landscape that did not require anything from him. Across the hallway, a floorboard shifted, a footstep careful and deliberate, then nothing. Meg had heard. She had stopped at the hallway without coming in, which was the correct thing, the thing a person does when they understand the difference between someone who needs help and someone who needs space and proximity simultaneously, which is the most difficult combination to offer because it requires you to be present without pressing forward. In the morning, the coffee was on the table before Cole came into the kitchen. Meg was at the window looking at the snow-covered pasture, her back to him. She did not remark on the night. She did not ask how he was. She had already answered both of those questions with the coffee in the window, in the silence which contained everything necessary. Cole sat down and wrapped his hands around the mug. "Thank you," he said. She turned from the window. "The east fence took some damage in the wind last night. I thought you might want to look at it this morning." "Yes," he said. They went out after breakfast. Duke ran ahead along the fence line, checking each post with the thoroughness of an animal who had appointed himself general inspector of the ranch's physical integrity. Cole followed with wire and pliers. Meg walked beside him and handed him what he needed without being asked. He found the notebook in March. The snow had begun its uneven retreat, pulling back from the south-facing slopes first and holding longer in the low places, in the shadows, and the ranch had begun to look like itself again, the color returning to the grasslands in patches, the mud season arriving with the particular difficulty of a transition that was harder than either what came before it or what would come after. Cole was clearing the ranch office for Meg, sorting what was personal from what was operational, organizing Frank Harlow's files into categories that would be useful for the estate and for the legal proceedings moving through the county court. He worked methodically, going through each drawer in sequence. The notebook was in the back of the secondary drawer, behind a hanging file folder that had slipped off its rail and fallen against the back panel, hiding what was behind it. Cole would not have found it if he had not been replacing the folder and reached all the way to the back to check for anything that had fallen. It was a standard composition notebook, black-covered Frank Harlow's name, written on the inside front cover, in the same small controlled hand Cole had seen in the ranch operational logs. He opened it. It was not a financial record. It was not an operational log. It was a set of research notes written over what appeared to be a 6-week period based on the dates at the top of each entry. Frank had been researching a program, a county-level initiative partnered with a veterans organization designed to identify agricultural land that could be transferred at nominal cost to former military service members who needed a place to restart after service. The program required a willing landowner, a qualifying veteran, and a parcel that met specific criteria for size and use. Frank had been identifying a portion of the Harlow Ranch acreage. He had been identifying it for this purpose specifically. The research notes covered the application process, the eligibility criteria, the timeline. In the margin of the third page, Frank had written a note to himself in the smaller handwriting he used for asides and questions. Cole read it twice. Find the right person, someone who's given enough, someone who needs somewhere to land. Cole stood in the office with the notebook in his hands for a long time. He thought about the county property office, the clerk who had processed his paperwork without apparent interest, the $10 transfer price that had seemed like bureaucratic indifference to a problem nobody wanted, the timing that had placed him here, in this specific location, on this specific night, in front of a window that a warped wooden frame had left unlatched since the summer 2 years before. He was not a man who organized his understanding of events around the concept of design. He had spent 13 years in environments where causality was brutal and random and did not arrange itself according to any principle he had been able to identify. He had seen things happen to people who deserved better and had seen people avoid consequences they had fully earned, and he had long ago stopped expecting the world to reflect the moral order it was theoretically supposed to embody. But he stood in Frank Harlow's office in March with Frank Harlow's notebook in his hands, And he thought about a man who had built something real over 22 years and had spent the last 6 weeks of his life trying simultaneously to expose the person who was stealing from him and to find someone who needed exactly what he had to offer, and he could not locate the word that covered what he was feeling, except that it was not comfortable and it was not small. He thought about the things Frank had done in those 6 weeks. The handwritten financial records meticulous and documented. The camera installed with Harlan Fitch's help. The paper trail created around it so that if anything happened, the purpose would be provable. The research into the Veterans Land Transfer Program, the margin note in the handwriting of a man who understood that what he was building needed to outlast him, even if he did not know that was what he understood. A man preparing for contingencies he hoped would not be necessary, and that proved in the end to be necessary after all. Frank Harlow had not saved himself, but he had saved everything that mattered. Cole brought the notebook to Meg. She was on the porch when he came out, sitting on the steps with a mug in her hands, watching Duke investigate the thawed edges of the south pasture with his particular brand of dedicated inquiry. She looked at the notebook when Cole held it out to her. She looked at his face. She took it. She read it slowly. She turned each page with the care of someone handling something that has acquired weight beyond its physical mass. When she reached the margin note on the third page, she stopped and read it twice. Then she closed the notebook and held it in both hands against her chest. He never filed the application, Cole said. He ran out of time. She was looking at the pasture, at Duke moving through the returning grass with his nose down and his tail moving in the slow arc of a dog who has found something worth investigating. He would have found you eventually, she said. He would have kept looking until he found the right person. He didn't get the chance to look. No. She turned her head and looked at Cole. But here you are anyway. Cole looked at the pasture, at the south fence line they had repaired in the wind, at the barn that was standing correctly because they had reinforced it in the blizzard, at the east gate that Duke had already checked this morning and found to be functioning as expected. I had the truck loaded, he said, when the legal case was filed, when it looked like things were moving to resolution. I had it loaded. Meg looked at him. She waited. I kept not leaving, Cole said. She stood up. She went inside, and when she came back, she was holding a document. She had folded it lengthwise, and she handed it to Cole without preamble or ceremony. He unfolded it. It was a property amendment form. His name was already filled in on the co-owner line. Her signature was at the bottom, dated 2 weeks ago. My father wanted this, she said. Not this specifically, but this, someone who would stay. Cole looked at the document. He looked at Duke, who had come back from the pasture and was sitting at the foot of the steps, watching him with amber eyes that had already assessed the situation and reached a conclusion and were simply waiting for the human to catch up. He thought about the drive into Duskfield, the clerk who had stamped the papers, the night he had walked across the grasslands with Duke at his shoulder reading terrain by starlight, the footage frozen at 2043, Dugan's voice on the phone at 6 in the morning, steady as the man himself, the blizzard and the wolves and the January nights and the coffee on the table before he came into the kitchen. He thought about what a man does when he has spent 13 years being useful in ways that cost everything and has arrived at a place that does not need what he was trained to give but needs what he has left. He thought about Frank Harlow, who had built 100 acres into something real, who had documented every number and installed every camera and written in every margin note, and who had known without ever meeting Cole Raines that the right person for the land he was building toward was someone who had given enough and needed somewhere to land. He folded the document carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. Duke stood up. His tail moved in 2 slow arcs and then stilled. He looked from Cole to Meg and then back to the pasture, already identifying the next thing that required his attention. The south fence needs another look, Cole said. I know, Meg said. I saw it this morning. He went down the porch steps. Duke fell in beside him, matching his pace, taking his position at Cole's left shoulder with the ease of an animal for whom the positioning required no thought at all. It was simply where he belonged and where he went. Behind them, the ranch house stood the way it had stood for 22 years, through weather and seasons and the various pressures that land and time exert on the things people build and the things people trust. The mountains beyond the ridge were carrying the last of the winter snow in their highest places, releasing it slowly, and the meltwater was finding its way down through the creek beds and into the soil of the lower pastures, and the grass was coming back the way it always came back without ceremony, because that was what it did. The legal proceedings moved through the county court with the deliberate pace of a system that had been designed to get things right rather than to get them quickly, which was as it should be. Wade Colton's attorney filed motions. Dugan's office answered them. Maddox's forensic report was entered into evidence. The financial investigator's findings were entered into evidence. Harlan Fitch's documentation was entered into evidence, and Gus Tanner's statement was entered into evidence. The footage from the micro SD card that Frank Harlow had installed in a matchbox-sized camera inside a smoke detector casing in his own ranch office was entered into evidence, and the timestamp on its final frame, 2043, was entered into evidence. And the 64 minutes between that timestamp and the moment the generator shed exploded were entered into evidence, and the 7 words that Wade Colton had said across a desk to a man who had saved him from ruin 15 years earlier were entered into evidence. Wade Colton was charged with first-degree murder, destruction of property, and financial fraud. He pleaded not guilty. The trial date was set for fall. Cole did not follow the legal developments closely. He followed them the way he followed weather, with enough attention to understand what was coming and enough detachment to stay focused on what was immediately in front of him, which was the ranch. There was always something in front of him. In April, the mud season came, and the lower pasture fence that had been stressed by the winter's freeze-thaw cycles required systematic replacement over 3 weeks of methodical work that Cole did in sections, moving along the line from east to west, pulling old posts and setting new ones, and running new wire and checking tensions with the same attention to completeness that Frank Harlow had brought to everything he had built here. Duke worked the perimeter while Cole worked the fence, and sometimes Meg came out and worked beside him, and they talked, or they did not talk, and both were fine. In May, the cattle operation resumed limited production. A local buyer who had worked with Frank Harlow for 11 years reached out to Meg when he heard the ranch was coming back and offered the same terms he had offered Frank. Meg accepted. Cole sat in on the meeting and said nothing, and learned everything he needed to know about how the commercial side of the operation worked. In June, the first real warm days came, and the grasslands turned green, and the ranch looked like what it had been for 22 years before the winter tear and the legal freeze and the long, careful accounting of what Wade Colton had done to it. Cole stood at the south edge of the pasture one evening in June and looked at it in the long, horizontal light of a Montana summer evening, and thought that Frank Harlow had built something worth taking care of, which was the only thought necessary. The trial began in September. Cole and Meg testified on consecutive days. Cole testified about the circumstances of the property purchase, the discovery of Meg hiding in the house, the information she had provided, the reconnaissance he had conducted, the entry into the office building, and the recovery of the micro SD card. He testified in the same way he had reported in after operations for 13 years factually, and without embellishment and without omission, and under cross-examination he answered every question the same way. The defense attorney tried several angles and found that each one came to the same place, which was a man who had done what he said he had done for the reasons he said he had done it, and whose account was corroborated at every material point by physical evidence and independent witnesses. Harlan Fitch testified. He was in his 60s and slightly stooped, and he wore a flannel shirt to court because he wore a flannel shirt everywhere, and he sat in the witness chair and answered questions in the careful, measured way of someone who understood that the words he chose mattered. And he told the court about the conversation with Frank Harlow, the camera unit he had helped select and install, the paper records he had kept, because Frank had asked him to keep them, and because Harlan Fitch had spent enough of his life in environments where records mattered to understand why a man might want them. He said that Frank Harlow had told him he needed to document what was happening before someone decided to make the problem disappear. He said it the way Frank had said it, without drama, as a statement of practical necessity from a practical man. Gus Tanner testified. He sat in the witness chair and told the court about the call he had received at 8:43 on the night Frank Harlow died, about the instructions he had been given about his arrival at the property, about what he had seen and reported to investigators in the days that followed. He testified without looking at Wade Colton, who sat at the defense table in a gray suit and the composed expression of a man who had decided that composure was his last remaining asset. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. Wade Colton was found guilty on all 3 counts. Cole heard the verdict from Dugan's office, where Dugan had called to inform them directly. Cole thanked him and put the phone down and went out to where Meg was in the barn doing the afternoon feeding, moving through the familiar routine of the work with the ease of someone who had grown up doing it and had come back to it after a long interruption and found that the knowledge was still there, that the body remembers what the hands were taught. He stood in the barn doorway and told her. She kept working. She finished filling the last water trough and set down the bucket, and then she stood still for a moment, both hands resting on the top rail of the pen, looking at nothing in particular. "Okay," she said quietly. That was all. It was enough. It was the right amount. Duke came in from the pasture and sat in the barn doorway, beside Cole, watching Meg, with the attentive amber gaze of a dog who was monitoring for information and finding the situation stable. Cole looked out at the pasture behind the barn, green and wide in the September light, the mountains visible on the horizon with the particular clarity of early fall, when the air has dried and the distance seems both farther and more reachable than it does at other times of year. He looked at all of it and thought about a $10 piece of paper that had brought him here, and a notebook found at the back of a desk drawer, and a margin note in the handwriting of a man he had never met, who had somehow in the last 6 weeks of his life understood something about what was needed and who was needed, and had not quite gotten to the point of arranging it when the time ran out. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out the property amendment form. He had been carrying it since March. He looked at it for a moment in the September light, his name on the co-owner line and Meg's signature at the bottom. Then he folded it back along its crease and put it back in his pocket. He did not need to look at it. He knew what it said. Cole Raines walked out across Frank Harlow's land, with the afternoon light moving golden across the pasture and the mountains holding their distance on the horizon and the dog at his shoulder, and he did not look back because there was no reason to look back. There was enough ahead of him to look at.